Ladies and gentlemen, a big warm welcome to Billy Chitkin, also known as Gurnge online. Check him out.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, Maxon. Thank you, everyone here, for choosing to spend your time with me this afternoon. And also hello to everyone on the internet and back home. So as Matthias said, I am Billy Chitkin. Today we're going to be talking about a project that was really special to me. It's something that I worked on last year and then into earlier this year. And it is creating a real-life rally car that was built and driven in the real world. It's a really special project to me because it was... start our timer. Okay. It was something that... it was a perfect storm. I got to work with some of my good friends. I got to work on a project for a client that I really, really like and have been a fan of. And it was a project that fit my skill set quite well. So let's kind of get into it. So here's a render of the Kazi, the car that I worked on. And here's a photograph of it built and driving. As I said, it exists in the real physical world, and it's driven all around the world. So real quick, who am I? I am a freelance 3D designer and animator based out of Detroit, Michigan. Additionally, I'm co-founder of a collective workspace named Box Fort. Back home, it's an office that a bunch of my friends and I freelance out of. And we just have a really awesome time hanging out, helping and collaborating with one another. In the past, I've been an adjunct professor, a teaching assistant, and I go by my made-up internet name, Gurnge. Let's just take a look at my reel, and you guys will get a sense of who I am as an artist. So that's my URL. Thank you. As you can see, I come from a more standard motion graphics background, and so it's maybe a little bit weird to see that I contributed to building a real car. I still don't quite believe that it happened, but thank you to all of my collaborators and clients that I work with, as you saw on that work commercially and both personally. So we'll jump back to our not a slideshow. All right, so what is this project? As I said, I helped design, model, texture, and render this iconic rally car for professional driver Ken Block. I worked alongside Ash Thorpe and Leo Estevez. Together, we reimagined this 90s rally racing icon in order to bring it around the world to race throughout 2019. If you'd like to, you can visit Ash or Leo's websites, as linked or shown here. And I cut my own process video, which involved my perspective of the job. So we'll take a look at this. All right. right, so as we can see, a whole lot was involved in this project. Shout out to everyone listed here. Pat's on there, and the polygon pen tool is my favorite thing. So we'll get onto that in a second. Close that down. Jump back to our not a slideshow. So I don't know if you've asked in your head up to this point, but who is Ken Block, or what is Hoonigan? Well, Ken is the championship professional rally car driver, a.k.a. the head Hoonigan in charge. Hoonigan, the brand that he helped co-found, is an automotive lifestyle brand. They make apparel, accessories, and their YouTube channels are a home to, well, hundreds of hours of super awesome automotive content. They're a little bit well known for a series called Gymkhana, which cumulatively have 500 to 600 million views. So let's just take a quick little look and see, get a taste for what Ken does behind the wheel of these vehicles. So for the LA natives, we got a couple familiar locations here. And this small little brick schoolhouse is Boxfort, back home. So there's people in there watching live. Hi. So we'll jump on back. All right, last thing that I really want to talk about is what is the Kazi V2. So it could do the things that we just saw, but its primary focus is as a competition stage rally car. Now, stage rally is course-to-course racing consisting of teams with a driver and a co-driver. As you might imagine, the driver's job is to drive, and the co-driver has navigation notes. They work together to make sure that they can complete the event. The car itself, the Ford Escort RS Cosworth, a.k.a. the Kazi, was a Group A rally car in WRC from 1993 to 1998. So it's relatively old, at about 20 to 25 years. And it was part of what is called homologation. And these were cars that, in order to qualify for the series of racing events, they needed to be sold in a certain quantity near race spec to just, everyday citizens. So that enabled this car to become kind of a cult favorite back in the day, and there are a few thousand of them still roaming around Europe to this day. But overall, the goal was to find a way to combine modern aerodynamic and aesthetic properties from Ken's current WRC Ford Fiesta, but adapt them to the Kazi and stay true to its heritage. So, as I said, the car was built earlier this year, and it's participated in a number of events. This is just a quick little clip of it in Donegal, Ireland. We'll see shortly this beautiful vista that the car gets to drive through, and then Ken and Alex, the co-driver, working together, reading those notes.
4 in, very long, 70 over dip, right 5 minus in. Narrow, left 5 minus over kick, 215, left 6 over bump, into junction.
All right, so that's fun. That's the car. Let's go over what we're going to cover today. Ultimately, this was a 3-phase production job, beginning with exterior modeling, interior modeling and texturing, and then the final staging and renders for the vehicle's unveiling. Today, we'll cover cleanup, design, modeling, both low and high poly for the exterior. The interior, we're going to go over my photographic reference process, model, UV, unwrap, and texture and asset. And then in the end, we'll combine some of MoGraph's tool sets and get into a bit deeper of an exploration into Redshift. There's not a snowball's chance in LA that we get through all of this today, so I'm going to just really get into it now. So, let's get into cinema, finally. All right, so as I said, it's an existing car, and we decided it was probably not a bad idea to start with a stock model of the car, because the fabrication team, well, they would be cutting apart one of these stock models of the car. It's probably a good idea to have our dimensions and everything as a good starting point and be relatively accurate. So I'm going to use some of my quick menus. I'm going to turn on road shading with lines, and we'll see that this mesh is relatively triangulated. It's not really pretty, and I don't know about you, but I wouldn't really want to work with this as a starting point if I had to customize and remodel elements of this vehicle. So let's jump into the next slide. So cleanup and quadrangulation, which is an awesome word to say. What is that? As we jump into our next example. So here we have the rear wing of the vehicle. And again, this is the starting point as I'm taking each of these elements, breaking them into just a test scene, and then recombining them at the end. So we have our triangles. This is not a pretty mesh. It came from another outside piece of software, so I always like to just optimize the mesh just real quick. So that's under my U quick menu, U, O. We didn't see anything happen, but just in good faith, trust me, it did something. We can get 50% of the way there just by coming to our top camera and deleting half of this object. So we fixed half of it, because at this point, if we grab a symmetry object and we make sure that we hold Alt to maintain the proper parent-child hierarchy, if I fix half of this mesh, well, then the other half is just going to be symmetried across, and it's real easy to work from that. So I'm just going to turn off the symmetry while I work, and we'll get into the quadrangulation process. So if I jump to my polygon selection setting and I grab myself a selection, I recommend not doing this on the entire piece of geometry at a time. So that's why I've selected about half of this mesh to begin with. And then under the U quick menu, U, you'll find towards the bottom of the list, untriangulate is U. So, well, it did something. We can see it cleaned up an element of this mesh, but it didn't really do the best job that I'd expect it to. So if we hit U, we can see that Shift and U will bring up an option box where I can adjust this angle, and this is the angle threshold that Cinema 4D will determine what to or not to adjust in the untriangulate command. I've done this a couple times in practice, and I know that 20 is going to give me a halfway decent result in this case. A bit of experimenting and then undoing is never a bad idea, just to get a good starting point. But it's not perfect. So we're going to grab our polygon pen tool, M, E, and we're going to fix some of these remaining errors. Now, the polygon pen tool is probably the best tool, in my opinion, in Cinema 4D, and it is almost all of the modeling commands all rolled into one, but it's context sensitive. So if I hover over this edge and I hold Control, I can just click to remove it. So I can do that a few more times, and now I want to run this edge just by left-clicking from one vertex to the other, and I've rerun that edge loop. So this side's coming along, but down over here, it's not quite the prettiest thing yet. We still have a number of triangles that we want to deal with, and the reason we're shooting for quads or four-sided polygons as opposed to triangles or n-gons is it's going to be beneficial for us to grab edge selections, which are useful at the next stage of UV unwrapping. And just in general, it gives us a better mesh that will render more productively. It won't have as many artifacts due to the way that triangles subdivide at render time. If you're interested in learning more about that, another artist presented. Her name is Jess Herrera. She went over a lot of really good modeling topology and just sort of workflow stuff. So I would recommend checking out that. I'm just going to insert a couple more edges while I talk. And again, I'm just using left click, and now I'm going to kind of get rid of some of these. I can drag one point to its neighbor to just kind of get rid of those. And that section's looking pretty good. So I can grab the remaining section, and instead of going and selecting those polygons, I'm going to invert my selection, U, I, just to save myself a click. And we're going to try that untriangulate command once more. So U, U. It did okay. Again, we have one edge loop here. If I jump to edge selection, we can see this edge doesn't really go anywhere. It winds up terminating in a triangle. So I want to continue this along this section. So I'm going to double click that edge loop, and I'm going to basically duplicate it with the slide tool, M-O, holding control. We'll sort of drag that out a little bit. Grab our polygon pen tool and reconnect that. Get rid of that triangle. Get rid of that. So there are a few triangles left remaining. We can give ourselves a couple edge loops to just run these through. Oops. All right, so for the most part, this is getting there. There's always more work that we could do, turning our symmetry on. But if I just take a look at my already pre-made one, this is looking nice and good. For the most part, we are ready to move on. So you repeat this process 20 to 30 times, and you have the rest of the vehicle all ready to go. At that point, it's ready to begin the design and modification process. So we'll jump into one of the design and sketching sessions that Ash and I would do over Skype. And we would just talk through our plans, screenshotting this video, or screenshotting the progress renders of the car, and just drawing and talking, coming up with a plan for what we wanted to modify, how we wanted to adjust things, and really just come up with, the direction that we were going to be going in. So this happened a couple, maybe a dozen or so times, and there we go. All right. So as I was prepping this scene file, I made a little boo-boo, and I deleted all of my materials. I don't know about you guys, but if you've ever been handed a scene file and you have all of these question mark texture tags over here, this drives me insane. It's pretty easy to actually deal with that and remove those. So above our object list, we have this little eyeball. If we open this up, we can find all of the different component types in our scene. So I'm going to come down to tags, texture tag, select all, and then there's all of those, and I can just hit delete to get rid of all that junk. So there's a little freebie, but back onto the car. So I'm going to solo out this front fender because this is the section that I have prepped to explore today. So if we go back down to this original fender and I solo this object, we'll see that this is pretty close to the source fender, the source piece of geometry that was cleaned up. Now, it's not perfect. There's still a little bit more work to do. But for the most part, we just deleted the lower section because that's what we wanted to extend outwards and customize. So I've got my low poly base. I'm going to solo both of these at the same time. And we're going to start to get a look for how this process works. So I've got my low poly version. And the reason you want to start this low poly is it's really easy to pull and adjust and make tweaks to this portion of the car. At this point in time, it's really light, really quick. It's all about the iteration process. So if we jump to sort of the next step, which is a little bit higher poly, but still not quite all the way, we can see that I have beveled, sort of this section here. We've got a little bit more roundness, and I have a couple extra edges selected sort of like here. And the reason these are present now is if we drop this into a subdivision surface, again holding Alt to make sure we organize the correct hierarchy. If I turn off my line mode and we just start to take a look, this is getting pretty smooth. We're getting there. This is still a long ways to go. We can see a good amount of pinching and some janky stuff sort of all around here. But for the most part, I'm just kind of picking my focus. You have to pick your battles in a project that takes this long. So you go through that process a couple more times, iterating and refining, working out with the rest of your team, and you come to the final mesh. So we can see that I've married together the new extended fender with the original upper portion of the fender. I've added more subdivisions where necessary in order to connect these objects. I've added edge loops, and I've gone through and used a little bit of topology know-how to just sort of figure out where I can and can't get away with triangles. There are a couple triangles present on this mesh, but for the most part, I kind of just try to confine them to insignificant portions as best that I could. Certainly is a challenge when you're undertaking the task of modeling an entire vehicle, as I said. So, don't sue me if you spot any triangles there. But we should be good to kind of move on to the next step. So as I said, you do that a whole lot. Eventually the car's finished. It's approved by Ken. We're ready to move on. So at this point, Leo begins the UV unwrapping process for the exterior of the vehicle in order to apply the graphic livery, which has all the sponsorship and decals and all that stuff. And at this point, I decided to take on way more of a task than was required of me and basically recreate as much of this interior as I possibly could. Now, late last year, still life rendering was a huge, there's a boom of it. People recreating the classic painterly look, but through rendering, I don't really like classical painting a whole lot, but I like cars. So I can put that same amount of effort and detail into capturing as many components of this interior. And the reason I wanted to do that was when it came time to render the car down the road, I didn't want to feel limited by our selection of camera angles. If we caught some boring, bland interior that had no detail or seemingly very little detail, I would have felt held back at the final phase of the job. So I went crazy and grabbed 20 to 30 screenshots from videos where they went through the Kazi V1 and just grabbed as much of this information as I could. Thankfully, we did so before we lost the Kazi V1 in an unfortunate accident. Ken and his co-driver were fine, but that car is no longer with us. Rally is a dangerous motorsport. But anyway, we're going to cover making the handbrake. That's this red thing here. So let's jump into our little demo scene. Well, actually, first, I have the full interior file of this interior, and I don't know about you, but I would be a little afraid of just instability or whatever in a live format such as this. So we're going to jump into just a simplified little test project. As we see, the geometry for this is quite simple, so it's not going to take us too long to model. So we've got a cylinder. It's at the right proportions. We're going to hit C to make it editable. Jump to our polygon selection. I'm going to grab an edge loop because I want to extend the top and bottom upwards. I can save myself a click and invert my selection and now use my scale tool to hold control and pull upwards on the Y little gizmo and extrude the top and bottoms upwards. I can grab more loop selections here and here, again use my scale tool to perform an extrusion in the X and Z axes by holding the corner gizmo here. And we're pretty much there. At this point, we want to add a little bit of beveling, so we can convert our polygon to edge selection by holding control, clicking here. And we can now save ourselves one more click by deselecting this ring selection, U, B, hold control, deselect, deselect. I now have the 4 edges I want to bevel. I can bevel M, S, come in tight on this, click and drag, get myself a couple subdivisions, and that's looking pretty good. I do want to just sew up the top and bottom, so ML, just to add some loop cuts with my knife tool. All right, so we should be set. At this point, we are ready to get into everyone's favorite thing, UV unwrapping. All right, so let's jump to our UV layout. Now, it's important to recognize where you can pick your battles in anything, but in particular UV mapping. If I come on down to my next slide, we can see where I need to actually UV map is just this center portion of the object, because we're going to be applying our logo sort of as a mask, and then applying this normal pattern to give ourselves an end result. So I really only want to focus on this center section. I can disregard the rest of the UV map, at least for the time being. So I can do so by going to my UV polygon selection instead of just the regular polygons. I can invert, again, to select all of that other stuff, and we can now just kind of get rid of this by going down to transform, and we can scale these to 0. So if we punch in 0 on X, 0 on Y, hit apply, that's now shrunk that to a minuscule amount. We can always get that back by just reprojecting those UVs if we need to, but for the time being, this is going to save me some trouble. I'm free to move on to the next step, which is setting up the fact that I want to apply this texture to both sides of the handle. And I can do so by selecting 1/2 of my UV map. Yeah. All right, so this represents 1/2 of our UVs, as we can see dollying around. I want to get this section to overlap this section. So if I bring my scale back to 1 by 1, because I don't want to do that, I can move this in -0.5. These two sections are now overlapping one another, and if I click and marquee drag through, we can see that I've now reselected the entire edge loops worth of UVs. I want to recenter these back to the center of our UV work plane, which is this gray square here. So if I moved it -0.5 in one direction, and I want to go halfway in the other direction, we can maybe guess +0.25. Woo. So we have a bit of equal space on the left and right side of our UV layout, and that's going to be, again, important. Our texture image has an even amount of spacing on both sides, so it's important to maintain that aspect ratio. So we can jump into our Redshift layout now and get into the fun stuff. All right, so we've got just this basic little material. Got a bit of red, sort of aluminum kind of looking. And I don't know about you, but I find it distracting when I'm developing shaders if my background is visible. This is just a simple dome light with a Grayscale Gorilla Pro Metal texture input. But I want to turn off the background. So we're going to disable that. And I just get a black background. I only have to focus on the object at hand. So let's jump into our Redshift shader graph and start exploring. So I'm going to work with the real estate here on the screen. And we can see, if you're familiar with the Everyday Material Collection from GSG, this is a familiar node layout. It happens to be the Warren Platinum metal material, which is pretty easy to drag and drop for the most part. I haven't changed a whole lot other than this color correct node. So we've got this cool red color going on, but where's that coming from? Well, we've input a bit of hue and saturation into the settings here on this Redshift node. And if I just jump that saturation back to 1, which is the default value, we can see it gets quite a bit more pale. So again, pretty simple. It's just a basic metal material with a little bit of color added in. We'll jump that back to the previous setting. And we'll dig on down here to some stuff that I have hidden down below. So we've got our logo texture, and it's running through a ramp. So let's connect this to the output. If I just sort of zoom out, here is our output surface node, and I'm going to be using a hotkey that I set up a lot. It is called connect node to output. So in my opinion, when you're developing shaders in whatever render engine you're using, you're flying blind if you're not constantly checking each component of your shading network. So I use this frequently, so I'm going to just connect that node with my hotkey, and we will see that we have ourselves our little logo. And if we jump down, we can see that this is just a grayscale texture. And we're going to start using this in a manner that's similar to Photoshop. I like to compare learning new software to older software that I've learned. And in the context of a Photoshop mask, we know that white will reveal an element and black will obscure that element. So we'll come in and we've got our current metal material. I'm going to call this shiny. And we'll duplicate that, and we'll call the copy rough. Bear with me, and we'll reconnect our output nodes. This is always the best part of watching a tutorial that involves Redshift. 'Cause, 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 'cause All right, so if we reconnect our output node, we shouldn't expect anything to have changed because, well, it hasn't. We have a ramp node here, and this is coming through our roughness reflection. So if we adjust this ramp, or if we click onto its settings, we can see I have a white to black gradient, pretty straightforward, and I have this knot here in the middle. So if I pull this leftwards, we'll see that the reflection will appear quite a bit more dull. Let me just kind of come around to get a better angle for you guys. That's why everything feels backwards, because the render view was inverted. I've been wondering. So, we've got our roughness material. I can adjust the sort of shininess of this just by moving this middle knot a bit leftwards, which exposes more white from that texture map, and that gives us a rougher, broader specular lobe. And we can jump down to our material blender now. So the material blender is an incredibly powerful node within Redshift, and it allows us to combine elements from multiple shaders. So if I go through and set up this new rough material into my layer 1, we can see that the logo image is being run into the blend color input. So if we connect this to our output, we'll see that very quickly we have ourselves the shiny and rough sections of this texture. We've got a couple more things to set up, but we're getting there. So I have this knurling pattern, and again, referring back to our slide, that is this cross-hatched grid, which is going to give us a machined or textured finish, which is present in the real item from our photography reference. So let's go and get that implemented into our shader now. We input normal texture maps into our shading network through a bump node. So let's go ahead and duplicate the previous bump node and run this. We can see that it's set to tangent space normals, which is the appropriate setting for a colorized, red, green, and blue traditional normal map. But we want to combine the effects of both of these bumps now, and we need to do so similarly how we used the material blender in the previous step, now using the bump blender. So we'll drop that in. We'll connect the previous scratchy metal into our base input, and we'll connect that output into that section of the texture. Now we shouldn't be seeing anything happen quite yet. We're going to drop this new knurling texture into input 0, which is going to be the next input down the list. Input that. And again, we shouldn't be expecting to see anything too drastically change because, well, in the bump blender settings, we have this weight value for the input that we just worked with. We need to bring this up to 1. Now if I get in tighter, we can see that we now have that grid-like pattern playing a role in our shading. I don't know about you, but I want to increase the strength of that a little bit just by adjusting the height. So we'll kind of bump that up to 1, get a little bit more pronounced of an effect. So we're getting there. The last little detail that I want to implement into the shader is where the logo is present, I want that to be machined or sort of bumped inwards into the material surface, which again is another one of those small details that is present in the real item. So we're going to jump and grab another bump map node just by holding control, duplicating that other one. So we'll run our logo image into this bump map. But our logo was a grayscale image, white and black. We have a setting here to adjust on the bump map. Because we were working with a tangent space normal, we now want to put that back onto height field. And we'll drop that into the bump blender, another input. Again, shouldn't be expecting anything to happen until we bring up our weight. And if we get in tight, oopsie daisy, we can see that it looks like it's actually protruding outwards. That's a simple fix. Our bump map can be flipped from +1 to -1. And we now have that machined inwards. And actually, on the bump blender, I forgot to add or check on additive mode, which is going, again, following Photoshop logic. An add blending mode will add layer onto layer onto layer so that we get the combined effect of all of these different bump inputs. So that's creating one of about 80 different props inside of the interior of the vehicle. I think it's about time to move on to the next step. and that is going to be covering the shader switch in combination with the object ID attribute. So on a lot of these more generic materials for the interior of the car, such as all the plastics, metals, rust, etc., I wanted to find a way to only have to control as few nodes or as few materials as I humanly could, because I'm lazy, and the shader switch is the perfect tool for that job. All of these metal fittings are the same material. I'm just simply changing the diffuse color, so that way if I adjust their dirtiness or the reflection properties, those changes propagate through all of the colors. So let's go ahead and set that up. We can do so just with our little scene with our handbrake. So we're going to duplicate this object because, well, if we want multiple objects with multiple colors, it's not a bad idea to have multiple objects first. We can go select all of our different handbrakes, and we'll turn on our render view. Shouldn't be expecting anything to happen. We've only merely duplicated our objects. We need to right-click and add a redshift tag, object tag, and this is the attribute that I mentioned, object ID, that we want to add onto each of these different objects. So if we come over to the object ID tab, we check on our override, we can now input a different ID for each different object. Again, I'm lazy. I don't want to have to enter in 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. So there's a cool trick inside of Cinema 4D, and that is typing in the letters N, U, M. And if I hit enter, this will now, in sequence, enter in a value, a different value, 0, 1, 2, 3, sequentially down for however many objects that you have selected. So I've saved myself a couple clicks. Again, shouldn't be expecting anything to happen visually here on our render, so we'll just pause that. We'll come up. As we recall, the color correct node was where we input that red color. So let's duplicate a couple copies of that. And we'll adjust the hue on each one. And I'm going to be a little sloppy with my node layouts. So apologies there. So I've input a different hue into each of these different objects, but again, shouldn't be expecting anything to happen quite yet. I do want to reconnect this triplanar input on each of these, just so that I get the underlying scratchy stuff to come through. All right, I lied. I have to arrange them. I'm sorry. All right, so that shader switch, that was the first thing I mentioned on this slide. So let's find ourselves that shader switch. Now, if we select this shader switch, we can see on the attributes panel, we have a shader selector input. More on that in a moment. But we have colors 0 through 9 sequentially. So this can take 10 inputs. It's quite flexible. So we'll go through and input all of these into shader 1, 2, 3, and 4. Or sorry, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Again, computer indexes start at 0 because we're super cool. I'm going to reconnect these to my diffuse color. And if we click render, well, they've all changed color to the same color. That wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but we need to actually work with that object ID attribute that we assigned to each of these different objects. So we can do so by searching through our nodes for user data. Now, there are 4 types of user data within Redshift. We're just going to cover integer user data because object ID is a numerical value and integers are numerals. So if we drop our integer user data, we have an attribute slot. Now, you don't have to know exactly what to type in because we've got a little twirl down and we can find object ID. And drum roll, please. Boom. So we have each object as a different color, and we can go through and edit the, say, reflective properties of these. We'll see that they'll all update with us. If our art director comes by and says, let's turn one of those yellow, we can say, oh boy, that change is going to take days, but actually, it only takes a matter of seconds. And we are ready to move on to the next example. So, staging the scene for our final set of renders. Now, we came to the realization that as the car was being built, we were going to need to create the actual promotional images for the full unveiling of the car. Now, this was, quite an opportunity. Certainly, many people would see this vehicle, but I didn't know what environment we would want to render it in. It's a rally car, so we could conceivably see it driving in snow or in dirt or in rain. And I wanted to build in as many controls into my Redshift shader to control or be able to art direct those different properties. So we can do so with more user data. So we just went over the integer user data, but we can make our own attributes if we know how. So let's explore that. So if I just scale out a little bit on my shading network, we can see the car as is with a bit of dirt applied to it. And if we pop down into our shading network, we can start to see what we've got going in here. Now this is an extremely simplified version of this car paint just for demonstration purposes, but we can break this out sort of layer by layer, again using our hotkey to connect to the output. So let's just see the base material, which is the livery on its own, and pretty straightforward, nothing too wild. It's just a single bitmap texture running into this for the time being. But I've got a dirt material, and this is actually using a Redshift reference node. So this is pulling in the entire inputs of another node into this. It's basically, to use After Effects terminology, it's kind of like a pre-comp in your shading network. So it's pretty powerful. If we get in tight on this dirt, we can see with a render region, hopefully that comes through, that there's a bit of a gritty sort of textureness. If I want to add like splotchy or chunky mud or snow, hunks, I've got all that control, and I just simply have to change the color of this dirt from brown to white, and boom, we're in a snowy environment. Pretty straightforward. So we'll pop back out to our full render, and we'll take a look to the next section. So because at this point, we have the sticker livery applied to the car. That, of course, means that the car has been UV mapped at this point. I can save that UV map out and jump into Photoshop and begin to paint a dirt texture. So if we just connect this dirt and color correct node, we can see a, come on now. Alrighty, it's got signs of life. All right, we're back. So if we get in tight, we can see these nice, splashes and streaks of mud, somewhat intelligently placed behind like the rear wheel or on the leading edge of the car. And again, following Photoshop logic, we are going to use this as a mask for the dirt. But we've got something to set up first. So we're going to pause our render view and come over to the whole null that the entirety of the car is within, and we're going to add a user data. So we're going to come in, and I like to name my stuff descriptively. I don't know about you, but something like body, dirt, amount. Oh, dirt. Sounds pretty reasonable of a name to me. I'm going to double click and copy this string of text because I need to input it exactly in a following step. So just to make sure that I don't misspell anything. But moving on to the remaining section of this user data node, I want to give myself, or Ash, a slider so that it's easy to drag up or down the amount of dirt. But I don't want to work in a percentage. I want to work in a real. And I actually want to change my max value from 1,000 to 1. Because again, employing that Photoshop logic, and which is what Redshift is going to prefer in the way that I'm building this node setup, is 0 to 1. 1 will reveal the texture, 0 will obscure that texture. So I can hit OK, I can actually adjust the step value just to give myself a little bit more granularity with that slider control. And we can see we've got this new slider. If we turn our IPR back on, turn off region, well, it's not doing anything because we haven't input the necessary steps, but we're getting there. We can come down to this scalar user data. Again, that's one of the 4 types of user data. And we have our attribute name slot right here. Instead of using the twirl down, I actually need to know what I'm going to be typing in because I just made myself a custom attribute. And I can go ahead and paste that string of text. Now, the nice thing about using user data to do this is user data applied to a parent object will propagate down to all of the child objects. So in a fully fledged scene where I've got my wheels, my tires, the windows, the glass, the headlights, etc., I can employ this same shading logic, and one slider will control all of those different elements. But anyway, back to the node setup. So we've got this scalar user data, and if we connect that to our output, we can examine the effect that it has. So right now, our slider is at 1. We're expecting a full amount of the material, and at 0, we should expect black. So we'll run through and connect that into our color layer. I'm going to turn on my layer input, which is where that new scalar user data is being plugged into as a layer 1 mask. And if I connect this color layer, which again functions similarly to the material blender or bump blender, where I'm combining these different attributes or different data nodes and shaders, this color layer is where the effect actually happens. So at 0, we have no dirt, and at 1, we have all of our dirt. And we can slide in between. You can set up similar properties for rain and other, grime or elements that you want to add to your object. And if we reconnect that color layer in the proper place on our material blender, we can reconnect the material blender again, which is combining the dirt and paint. And we have our slider where we can go from no dirt to full dirt just with a slider. We can use take system or just set up separate renders, send it to the rest of our team, art director, etc., and just really have a lot of flexibility. So we'll pause that down, and I think I'm right about my time limit. So we'll get back onto the sort of ending of this. Unfortunately, don't have time, but I'll be in the back, and we can explore this last and final setup if you'd like. But yeah, feel free to connect with me online. My website, again, is gurnge.com. My Instagram and Twitter handles are visible at Gurnge, as you can see. Additionally, my email address is bchitkin@gmail.com if you would ever like to reach out to me or say what's up. And it's entirely possible that you've interacted with me if you're a Slack user, because I'm on pretty much every dang Slack related to motion graphics. A couple things to plug at the last minute are my tutorial and live stream page on my website. Just has an archive of things that I've worked on, tutorials. I used a lot of hotkeys and scripting to just be a little bit more efficient in today's demonstration. So I've got a series of 3 tutorials kind of going over that, how you can become a more efficient artist inside of Cinema 4D. If you're interested in the project itself, you can hear a bit from Ash's perspective on his podcast, episode 200. If you're interested in the car, the Kazi itself, you can check out more on Ken's YouTube channel to see the building process, it being tested and actually raced around the world. Another thing that I want to shout out is my, but the monthly user group that I go to back home in Detroit. We meet every month, and organized by our awesome Julie Kraft. You can find out more information at MoGraph Mondays on Twitter. It's expanded into other cities like Lansing and Grand Rapids, Michigan, also in Cleveland, Ohio, Boston, Massachusetts, and Ottawa, Canada. So we're expanding into the northeast sections of North America. Speaking of events, I love attending events such as this, getting to meet other artists, and just becoming a more ingrained member of the community. I've posted a couple of the extra events that I'll be at throughout the remainder of this year. Feel free to Google any of these things if you care to find more information about them. The last thing I do want to, hopefully, fingers crossed, see at the SEMA car show. If the Kazi survives the rest of its duties, I hope to be able to see it in November. And that's it. Thank you.